The wind howled through the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow, rattling the shutters of the old house that stood on the edge of the dark woods. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, a sound too close, too deliberate. Jenny stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She could swear she wasn't alone, yet no one else had been foolish enough to come out here. Not at this hour, not with the stories of the Shadow Man. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the overgrown path leading to the house. She heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something moving just beyond the trees. She turned quickly, the beam of light struggling to penetrate the darkness. For a brief moment, she thought she saw him, a tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree-line, watching. But then he was gone, swallowed by the night as if he had never been there at all. The whispering wind seemed to call her name. The house was known to the locals as the Thompson House, though no one could quite remember the last time anyone with that name had lived there. It had been abandoned for years, crumbling into decay with each passing season. Children dared each other to approach it, but few ever did. They all feared the same thing, the Shadow Man. Jenny wasn't one for ghost stories. She had never been the type to scare easily. But ever since moving to Black Hollow to live with her aunt, she'd heard the tales, the warnings, the strange whispers from her new classmates. They all said the same thing: don't go into the woods, and whatever you do, don't go near the Thompson house at night. She wished she had listened. Jenny had come out here to prove a point, to show the others that the stories were just that, stories. But now, standing at the edge of the overgrown yard, her flashlight trembling in her hand, she wasn't so sure. The wind picked up again, this time stronger, colder. It carried with it a whisper, a voice, faint but clear. Jenny. She spun around, but no one was there. Just the trees, their branches creaking under the force of the wind. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to the house. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed back and forth. She swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear rising in her throat. There was no turning back now. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Every step Jenny took seemed to echo through the empty rooms, as if the house itself were alive, listening. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She felt as though something was watching her from every corner, every shadow. She hadn't even made it to the staircase when the temperature in the room dropped, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The light from her flashlight dimmed for just a moment, flickering again as she pointed it towards the stairs. At the top of the landing stood a figure, tall, dark, motionless. The beam of her flashlight barely caught his silhouette, but she could see enough. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Jenny's hands trembled, her breath quickening. She felt rooted to the spot, her legs heavy as lead. The Shadow Man. He was real. She blinked, and just like that, he was gone, vanished into the darkness as though he had never been there at all. But Jenny knew better. The stories were true. The Shadow Man was watching her. Jenny stumbled back, her mind racing. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, not even her aunt. No one knew she was here. She had come to prove a point, but now all she wanted was to leave. The front door was just a few steps behind her, yet her legs wouldn't move. It was as though something was holding her in place, a force stronger than her own will. She tried to calm herself, taking slow, deep breaths. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks on her, feeding into the stories she had heard. But deep down, she knew it wasn't her mind playing tricks. Something was in this house with her. Another creak echoed through the house, this time from upstairs. Jenny felt her skin crawl as she turned the flashlight towards the staircase again. Her heart pounded in her ears as she slowly backed away, inching closer to the door. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Jenny ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic surging through her veins, but the door remained firmly shut, as if it had been locked from the outside. Her pulse raced as she banged on the wood, hoping, praying, that someone would hear her. But the only response was silence. The temperature in the room continued to drop, and her breath came out in small, white puffs. She felt an icy chill creeping up her spine. Turning around slowly, she saw the shadows shifting in the corners of the room, moving like liquid smoke. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the house, faint but unmistakable. "Why did you come here?" It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was deeper, more menacing, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jenny's chest tightened with fear as she spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But the room was empty. Then, as if in answer to her question, she saw him again, just for a moment. The Shadow Man. His figure loomed in the doorway to the next room, shrouded in darkness. His presence seemed to suck the light from the room, leaving only a cold, suffocating void in its wake. And then he disappeared once more. Jenny's mind raced. She needed to get out, but the door wouldn't budge. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out, but all the windows were boarded up, and there were no other exits. Her flashlight flickered again, the light becoming dimmer by the second. Desperate, she moved towards the fireplace, her gaze falling on an old, dusty book that sat on the mantel. It was large and bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. The title was barely legible, written in faded gold letters, The Book of Shadows. She hesitated for a moment before reaching for it. The second her fingers touched the leather cover, a wave of cold rushed through her body, and the house seemed to groan in response. Her instincts told her to leave it alone, to run, but curiosity got the better of her. Opening the book, she found page after page filled with strange symbols and cryptic writing. It didn't make any sense to her, but something about it felt wrong, dark, as if it wasn't meant for human eyes. Then, as she turned the page, she saw a drawing that made her blood run cold. It was a crude sketch of a tall figure, cloaked in shadow, his eyes nothing more than hollow, empty voids. The Shadow Man. And beneath the drawing, a single sentence was scrawled in jagged handwriting. He is always watching. Suddenly, the house shuddered, and the shadows on the walls began to shift and writhe as if they had come to life. Jenny dropped the book, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She tried to back away, but her legs felt heavy, as though they had been anchored to the floor. The whispering started again, growing louder, more insistent. She couldn't make out the words, but the voices seemed to swirl around her, filling her head with a low, menacing chant. She clutched her head, trying to drown them out, but they only grew louder. Then she felt it. A searing pain shot through her arm, and she cried out, clutching the spot just above her wrist. Looking down, she saw a dark, twisted symbol etched into her skin, like a brand, still burning with a deep, unnatural heat. The mark of the Shadow Man. From that night on, Jenny was never the same. Even after she managed to escape the house, though she could never quite explain how, something followed her. The air around her was always cold, her shadow seemed longer, darker, and she could feel it. The weight of eyes constantly watching. She tried to tell her aunt, but her words always came out wrong, her thoughts scrambled. It was as if the Shadow Man didn't want her to speak of him, as though he had taken hold of her mind, twisting it into silence. But worse than the silence were the dreams. Every night she dreamed of the house on Hollow Road, of the Shadow Man standing at the top of the stairs, watching her with those hollow, empty eyes. And in every dream, He came closer. No matter how far she ran, he always found her. Desperate for answers, Jenny began to dig into the town's history, hoping to find some explanation for the horrors she had witnessed. The townspeople were reluctant to speak about the Thompson house, their faces growing pale at the mere mention of it. But the more she searched, the more she uncovered a dark and twisted truth. Years ago, a man named Samuel Thompson had lived in the house with his family. He had been a respected man, a scholar, known for his fascination with the occult. But something had gone terribly wrong. His wife and children had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and soon after, Samuel had vanished as well. The locals believed that Samuel had opened a door to something dark, something that should have remained hidden. They spoke of the Shadow Man as if he were a force of nature, an entity that had taken root in the town ever since Samuel's disappearance. The more Jenny learned, the more the pieces fell into place. Samuel had been trying to summon the Shadow Man, to gain power beyond human comprehension. But in doing so, he had unleashed something far more dangerous, a force that couldn't be controlled. And now, it had marked her. Jenny knew there was only one way to end this. She had to go back to the house, to face the Shadow Man once and for all. She couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, feeling the weight of his gaze everywhere she went. Armed with nothing but the cryptic book and a sense of determination, she returned to the Thompson house, the wind howling as if warning her to stay away. The front door creaked open on its own as she approached, inviting her inside. The air was colder than before, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Jenny stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched the book tightly, flipping through the pages in search of something, anything that could help her. Then she heard it, the low, guttural voice that had haunted her for so long. "Why have you returned?" She didn't answer. Instead, she moved towards the center of the room, where a dark, swirling mist had begun to form. The Shadow Man emerged from the darkness, his figure taller, more menacing than before. But this time, Jenny wasn't afraid. She opened the book to the final page, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She didn't know what the symbols meant, but somehow she knew what she had to do. She began to speak, her voice strong and clear, reciting the words from the page. The house trembled, the walls groaning as the air grew thick with the smell of smoke and sulfur. The Shadow Man moved towards her, his hollow eyes locked on hers. But Jenny didn't stop. She kept speaking, the words pouring out of her mouth like a song, a chant that had been buried deep within her soul. Suddenly, the shadows in the room began to shrink, pulled towards the center where the Shadow Man stood. His figure writhed and twisted, his hollow eyes widening in shock. For the first time, he seemed afraid. With a final, desperate cry, the Shadow Man was pulled into the darkness, his form dissolving into nothingness. And then, there was silence. The house was quiet now, the air still. Jenny stood in the center of the room, her body trembling with exhaustion. The book slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. It was over, or so she thought. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room. A shadow. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, watching, waiting. Years passed, and the Thompson house fell into further decay, its windows boarded up, its doors locked. No one dared to go near it, not after what had happened to Jenny. But late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the shadows danced across the walls, people swore they could still see him. The Shadow Man. He was always watching, and he would never stop.